Thanks everyone for coming out. I'll wave a big general hello, and if I haven't said hi to any of you specifically, I'm sorry, I'm not wearing my glasses, so I'm blind. Oh, there, let me see. Okay, so I'm so happy to be at the Strand. It was the first New York City bookstore I ever visited when I moved here back in 1992. And if you could have told me when I was 21 years old and miserable working at Goldman Sachs that someday I'd be here talking about a book I had written, I don't think I would have been able to imagine that. So I wrote this book, Saudi America, essentially because I was obsessed with two things. And one is really a dichotomy, which is that shale is changing the world. We've gone from congressional hearings a decade ago about U.S. shortages of oil and natural gas to literally beating our chests about this concept of American energy independence, even what President Trump has called energy dominance. I quote a CME economist named Eric Norland in the book saying that fracking is one of the top 5 things reshaping geopolitics. And it is. Look no further than Saudi Arabia, which has seen unprecedented upheaval with the rise of the young prince Mohammed bin Salman. We call it Game of Thrones in the book. In no small part due to the pressure that low oil prices is putting on the kingdom, which to some degree is a function of U.S. shale. As to whether this is a good thing or a bad thing for us ultimately, I'll come back to that. As for my second obsession, who wouldn't be obsessed with Aubrey McClendon, the former CEO of Chesapeake? Love him or hate him, and they're both opinions out there, he's one of those remarkable characters that I think can make business stories read like novels. So I wrote this about McClendon from the book. No one was more right and more wrong, bolder in his predictions or more spectacular in his failures, more willing to risk other people's money and his own than McClendon. One banker who knew McClendon well puts it, the world moves when people who like risk take action. McClendon was born in 1959 when American oil still ruled the world, 2 years before OPEC was created. He died in a fiery car crash just 4 months after President Obama lifted the ban on exports. He was the good face of the industry, the passion, the creativity, and the daring, a former investment banker told me, but he was also the bad face. And that duality makes him the perfect personification of America's fracking revolution. His death, like his legacy, was a hotly contested subject. On March 2nd, 2016, just after 9 a.m., Aubrey McClendon slammed his Chevrolet Tahoe SUV into a viaduct under a bridge on a Midwest Boulevard in Oklahoma City, dying instantly. He was speeding, wasn't wearing a seatbelt, and didn't appear to make any effort to avoid the collision. He'd been indicted the day before by the Justice Department for price rigging. Investigators ultimately ruled this an accident, but rumors of suicide persist to this day. As Captain Paco Balderrama of the Oklahoma City Police told the press, we may never know 100% what happened. In the fall of 2008, Forbes had ranked McClendon number 134 on its list of the 400 richest Americans, with an estimated net worth of over $3 billion. But because he borrowed so much money and secured business loans with personal guarantees, 2 years after his death, lawyers were still wrangling over the remains of his estate, trying to figure out which debts would be paid, from the $500,000 he owed the Boy Scouts of America to the $465 million he owed a group of Wall Street creditors, including Goldman Sachs. Wall Street's vultures, hedge funds that invest in distressed debt, had descended, buying the debt for less than 50 cents on the dollar, essentially rendering a judgment that the claims wouldn't be paid in full. If McClendon did die broke, it wouldn't have been out of character. During his years as an oil and gas tycoon, he fed on risk and was as fearless as he was reckless. He built an empire that at one point produced more gas than any American company except ExxonMobil. Once when an investor asked on a conference call, "When is enough?" McClendon answered bluntly, "I can't get enough." In retrospect, it was kind of like Camelot, says Henry Hood, Chesapeake's former general counsel, who worked at Chesapeake from its founding in 1989 until the spring of 2013. There was a period of time that will never be duplicated with a company that will never be duplicated. McClendon tried and in many ways succeeded in reshaping the energy world. Ever since Daniel Yergin's The Prize, I've been fascinated by all things energy. And I quote from a recent missive that a CEO of an oil company put out, and he wrote, "Energy is critical for human survival. It's critical for security. Even world wars have been won and lost by those who had the most access to energy and the securest access to it." So I've been fascinated by Aubrey dating all the way back to 2010. It's many years. A source used to tell me, a guy I talked to all the time would say, Aubrey is the most important man in America, because if he was right and we could actually get all this natural gas at a low price, that would change the future of our country in many important ways. It was obviously a little bit of an overstatement, but those are forgiven. But if he was wrong, then, and many people thought and still think he was wrong, then that would take us in a different direction. McClendon isn't the pioneer, the person or people who figured out how to extract oil and gas from places in the earth that weren't meant to or hadn't yet yielded it. Most people agree that distinction goes to a guy named George Mitchell. And if you're curious about the advent of fracking, Greg Zuckerman's great book, The Frackers, really tells that story. But McClendon was the pioneer in the other essential part of the business, which is raising money. And I love this quote from a guy I talked to. He said, "As oxygen is to life, capital is to the oil and gas business. This industry needs capital to fire on all cylinders." And the founder and father of raising capital in the United States is Aubrey McClendon. To be able to borrow money for 10 years and ride out boom and bust cycles was almost as important an insight as horizontal drilling, McClendon, with typical immodesty, told Rolling Stone. And I love this. I was talking to an analyst for a big investment firm, and he said, I never let Aubrey McClendon in the door here because I knew we would have ended up buying a lot of stock. McClendon was that good of a salesman, but it wouldn't have ended well. And it didn't end well for the people who invested with him. Over Chesapeake's years in business, the company raised, I think, from 2003 through 2012, over $16 billion in equity and over $16 billion in debt through selling securities, and paid Wall Street over $1 billion in fees. And that fee number is important because it's always worth remembering that Wall Street can make money even when the businesses they're funding don't make money. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. McClendon also raised money for Chesapeake in all sorts of more subterranean ways, like doing these Enron-esque deals in which the company would sell a supply of natural gas and collect money up front and not really call it a loan, even though it was. And so this led to debates among the investment community over whether this business model actually worked or not. Another guy I spoke to would say he would have debates with his partner from the time the boom started, and he'd say, "The oil and gas are real," his partner would say. And this guy would respond, "Yeah, but the economics don't work." And this was true of McClendon's company, which after asset sales never produced free cash flow. And for those of you who are not finance types in the audience, think of free cash flow as the truest measure of what a business can pay for on its own without having to constantly raise new funds. And this is true of the industry overall, too. It wasn't just true of Aubrey McClendon, which is why he is so representative of this. In 2015, a well-known Wall Street guy named David Einhorn made a detailed case for betting against all of the fracking companies. He called a star company called Pioneer Natural Resources mother fracker. And he looked at the financial statements of the 16 largest publicly traded frackers, which included companies like Pioneer, and he'd found that from 2006 to 2014, the fracking companies had spent $80 billion more than they had received from selling oil and gas. And this encompassed a period when oil prices were over $100 a barrel. None of them generated excess cash flow. And so his contention was, this doesn't work from a financial standpoint. That is still true today. Even in the first quarter of 2018, analysis in the Wall Street Journal showed that only 5 of the companies had produced free cash flow. As an industry, shale is still losing billions and billions of dollars. I quoted a report in my book from a guy named Amir Azhar, who's a fellow at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy, and he said the real catalyst of the shale revolution was the 2008 financial crisis and the era of unprecedentedly low interest rates it ushered in. Most people don't think of that, but if it hadn't been for these record low interest rates in the wake of the financial crisis, the shale companies would never have been able to raise all of this money that they needed to fund their operations. So I've always thought most people think of shale, think of fracking, and you think chemicals going into the ground. And I've always thought the key ingredient in shale isn't so much chemicals, it's capital. So my book ignores some of the environmental issues created by fracking, not because those aren't critically important, but just because in a mini book of 30,000 words or so, there's only so much you can cover. I'd recommend Russell Gould's The Boom or Gary Cernovitz's The Green and the Black for anybody who cares to explore the environmental issues. But also perhaps because I'm cynical, and I think there's some truth to this notion that money rules the world. As long as we need non-renewables, and there's a question about how long that will be, I don't think environmental concerns are going to stop us from producing them. What will stop the music is if the money stops flowing. And this industry is fragile. In 2014, there was what some saw as a concerted attempt to kill it when at OPEC's annual meeting in the fall, Saudi Arabia refused to cut production. The idea was that would push oil prices down further, therefore wreaking havoc on America's fracking companies. And it did. Over 150 fracking companies eventually declared bankruptcy. Moody's, the credit rating agency, predicted in a report that this was going to be some of the worst financial bloodshed they'd seen. And I'm actually convinced that the bust is part of the reason that Barack Obama ended up overturning the ban on exports, because amid this bust, it no longer seemed like a big deal. Environmentalists were much quieter than they might otherwise have been. And so the ban on exports, instead of being this big deal that people wrote about and thought about, actually ended up getting tucked into the end of the year 2015 $1.1 trillion spending bill. If you weren't somehow invested in this, you probably didn't even know that it had happened, this momentous thing in American history where after 40 years of not being allowed to export oil, we could suddenly export oil again. And I talked to the lobbyist who shepherded that through Congress, and he said that the legislation had passed the House and then the Senate before noon on December 18th, 2015. By the early afternoon, President Obama had signed it. Then everyone raced out of Washington for the holidays. And this guy said, by 6 p.m., no one was left in town. To celebrate, I went to a restaurant in Bethesda and had a Manhattan and steak by myself. So amid the bust, when Aubrey McClendon died in the car crash in the spring of 2016, it seemed like a punctuation mark underscoring the end of things. It was the bottom. But like the proverbial phoenix from the ashes, Shale didn't die. It's come back stronger than ever. Believers argue that this proves the skeptics were wrong. I don't think it's quite so simple. There are a bunch of reasons I lay out in the book as to why it has come back, but one of the most important is because Wall Street was still there. The money hasn't dried up. Amid this era of low interest rates, pension funds are pouring billions of dollars into private equity firms. Private equity firms, in return, are pouring their money into shale companies. And the game works because publicly traded shale companies are valued in a way that makes it possible for them to have a valuable stock even when they're not producing profits. So the private equity funded companies can be sold to the publicly traded companies, and everyone involved in the daisy chain can make money until they don't. I wrote in my New York Times op-ed that I did the other week that it reminds me a little bit of the dot-com boom when companies were valued on a multiple of eyeballs. Everyone believes until suddenly they don't. So I'm not smart enough to see how this ends. To me, shale is kind of like calculus. It's not algebra. There's so many factors that go into figuring out where this will go, from technological improvements to the price of oil. And by the way, on the subject, one other little takeaway I had, that on the subject of forecasting the price of oil, the only takeaway I could come up with after studying the history of this is that everyone who ever predicts the price of oil is dead wrong. So the most prominent miss, of course, was the hand-wringing in congressional hearings back in the mid-2000s about our shortages. But what I would say is that there's reason to be worried. How real would the shale revolution be if companies could only produce the amount of oil and gas that they could fund with their own cash flow? An investor said to me, if companies were forced to live within the cash flow they produce, U.S. oil would not be a factor in the rest of the world and would have grown at a quarter to half the rate that it has been. Beyond that, I also came to realize that this whole concept of energy independence, which in its most robust form is sort of a screw the Middle East, use our oil and gas, our newfound oil and gas wealth to put the screws on Russia and China, is a bit of a fraud, and we can go into that in more detail if you guys are curious. But the major point there is that the price of oil is set globally now. We can't go back to the 1970s when America could control the price of a barrel of oil. It's set globally by events like what's happening in Libya right now, and there's no way to turn the clock back. But in the meantime, amid my lack of ability to predict where this is going, I was struck by Charlie Munger's comments on this. And those of you in the room who know who Charlie Munger is, he's Warren Buffett's famous and brilliant sidekick, still kicking at 90% plus and putting out searing pronouncements about the financial world. And he's argued that we should conserve what we have instead of drilling frantically, because for all the eventual certainty of renewables, and I think they are certain, there's still no substitute for hydrocarbons in several essential areas of modern life, namely transportation and agriculture. And part of why the U.S. can feed its population is because the yield per acre has increased so dramatically in the modern era. And that's in large part due to the advent of pesticides and other things that are made with oil extracts. And so Munger said to me, we need to eat as far out as you can see, he says. It's a serious problem, and I think that hydrocarbons as chemical feedstock are probably irreplaceable. They're like the topsoil of Iowa. You wouldn't want to use it as fast as possible. You would want to use it as slowly as possible. His argument is, until there's certainty, why would we be racing to make a big deal about energy independence and not import oil? His argument is imported oil and gas can be your friend, so we can conserve what we have. The lovely thing about being a journalist is that I don't have to have any answers about all of this. I don't have to know what our policy should be, but I think it would not involve beating our chest about energy independence and pumping what is a non-renewable from the ground in ways that make money for executives and private equity people short term, but don't even enrich shareholders, let alone the rest of us. So on that note, I will open it up to whatever questions you all might have.
You started off talking about Aubrey McClendon as a key player. I wonder if you could compare and contrast him with another famous salesman you've written about, Jeff Skilling, who obviously just got out of jail last week.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think they were both great salesmen. People used to tell me about Jeff Skilling. I actually think it was Diana Henriquez who said it to me the first time, who said that his intelligence was incandescent because he could condense these really complicated ideas into these sparkling, simple concepts that would make you just believe. And I sat in front of a courtroom and watched him almost convince the jury that he shouldn't be charged with any crimes at Enron because he was so convincing. And from what I've heard, Aubrey McClendon had exactly that same level of salesmanship, that ability to convince anybody of anything. I remember a private equity guy told me that he had sworn he would never do a deal with Aubrey, and he and another senior guy were sitting in the room, and they ended up giving Aubrey money by the time he had walked out. He was that convincing. I think Chesapeake had really, really convoluted finances. What Aubrey ended up being indicted for, which was this idea of that he was doing land deals that violated antitrust laws, that underpaid people for their land, is kind of crazy because Aubrey had a huge reputation for overpaying everybody for everything. So I don't know in the end that the comparison goes all the way to saying that McClendon too would have ended up in jail had he stayed alive. But I think the salesman comparison is very accurate.
Is there anybody taking Munger's thoughts to heart?
I don't think so. Munger told me that he would tell environmentalists that this is the argument you should be making, that we need to conserve, because in the end the future of a nation rests upon its ability, its energy security, its ability to feed its people, and that's an extremely compelling argument. But he said he hasn't found, and it's an interesting place where a guy who's completely from the world of finance sort of meets a cause that is not his. But he said he's had trouble getting anybody to pay attention to him on that front. So I head back there.
So with this kind of shifting extraction landscape, are we going to see more plastics production coming from these? I
think we will. Part of the change in the United States from having this surplus of cheap natural gas is that we are now one of the cheapest places in the world for all sorts of manufacturing. And it changes the picture here in ways that are probably good for jobs and for the economy in the short term, but perhaps questionable for the longer term. As a broader note, one of the things that really struck me in this book was sitting with very smart private equity people who might be investing in shale, but every single one of them was trying to figure out when renewables would signify the end of oil, because they all think it's coming. It's just a question of when. And some are not even investing in oil and gas anymore because they think the onset of renewables is that soon. And so it's another reason to me that it's crazy for us to be beating our chest about energy independence and celebrating the world that is, and perhaps missing the chance to be leaders in the world as it's going to be.
you're not an analyst, but speaking as a journalist, having interviewed all the analysts, what's your reading of the tea leaves? What's your sense? There's people who think, well, this is for real, it's going to go on, it's going to be successful, Exxon's buying it. Other people say, no, it's a shell game.
Yeah.
It's going to collapse. Do you have just your gut feel from...
My gut feel is always skeptical. I can't help myself, but that's reflexive and not necessarily right. It is. It's a total battleground. And what I think is just interesting is that this kind of Wall Street battleground between believers in shale who say technological improvement, drilling in this area of Texas and New Mexico called the Permian, which has created this unbelievable bounty, is going to change the financial firmament of this industry. And sure, it doesn't make money yet, but it's all going to. It's all on the come. And then the skeptics who say this is an industry that has never produced cash flow, whether oil prices were over $100 a barrel or under $50 a barrel, and the need for ongoing capital expenditures are so immense because shale wells show a very steep decline rate. And so if you're a publicly traded company and you need to keep producing growing earnings or growing production, you need to always keep investing in order to keep your production numbers up. I couldn't predict which way the debate will come out. What was interesting to me is that this debate, which people in the finance world kind of know, or at least people in the energy world kind of know, even the broader finance world doesn't really know it. And certainly most people, if you ask them, they think of shale as being environmentally controversial, but not financially controversial. And so that's one of the things that made me so interested in this. I wish I could have arrived at a more certain answer as to who was right or wrong. But just like with the price of oil, everyone who has forecast anything about shale has also been dead wrong, and so I have a little bit of humility about it. Go ahead, yeah.
Can you contrast the finances of shale oil as opposed to natural gas fracking?
I can't do it in a very detailed way from right here, but it is different. There is an argument that while shale oil may never be financially sustainable, shale natural gas may be, because the decline rates are not as steep. Fracking started with natural gas, not with oil. And when natural gas prices started to plummet, part of what undid Aubrey McClendon was the supply he had helped unleash. When natural gas prices started to plummet, everyone switched to oil, which people had never thought was possible before that. And so oil was sort of the second wave of fracking. And now we all forget that it started with natural gas. But there is an argument that natural gas is close to break even at prices as low as they are today. And so that this may be, that it may be financially sustainable. And I argue in the book that maybe in the end, Aubrey McClendon was actually right. He was a huge proponent of natural gas, argued that we should try to switch all of our transportation infrastructure to run on natural gas. And if we were thinking and trying to develop an energy policy, I think it would include that, because we do have a huge supply of cheap natural gas. And whether we have a huge supply of even moderately priced oil at any level that makes financial sense is a very open question.
So 4 years ago, the Saudis tried to essentially kill fracking by overproducing and crashing the price of oil. So do you think, looking back now, or in hindsight, did they achieve their goal?
No, I think the strength and resilience of U.S. frackers actually shocked Saudi Arabia. And I'm not sure, the conventional view is that they tried to kill U.S. shale. I think they had some of their own historical reasons as well for not cutting back production, because they tried to do that in the 1980s and sort of got their head handed to them. And their then oil minister had lived through that and wasn't about to yield ground, only to see what he viewed as financially weaker producers take his market share. But no, Saudi Arabia was absolutely shocked at the resilience of U.S. shale, and I think the reasons that it came back, as I said, include the discovery of fracking in the Permian Basin, which has given it this whole new lease on life. People in the industry say technological improvements. We're getting a price of oil out of the ground, a barrel of oil out of the ground now for so much less money than we ever did. But also the financial picture here. Ultra low interest rates are creating debt bubbles in all sorts of places, and I think fracking is one of them. How dangerous that ends up being, I don't ultimately know. I probably wouldn't predict that it would cause the next financial crisis, although that was the headline of a piece I wrote. But I think it's dangerous. Diana?
Let's talk about interest rates then, because from where they are now, it's inconceivable that they could go lower. It is almost certain that they will go up.
Yeah.
Add 300, 400 basis points. to where we are today, what happens to the willingness of private capital to keep financing this? I mean, I know you focused on what that would do to the debt load
Yeah.
of the borrowers, but what would it do to the supply of capital willing to invest here if they can invest in something safer and get a good return?
I think it would change the entire financial picture around the world, because one of the big problems we're facing is underfunded pension plans that can't make a return. And so they've been shoveling money into private equity firms, who in turn have been shoveling money into shale. And private equity pension plans have also put a lot of money into credit hedge funds that buy up credit instruments, because that's another way they can hope to make a return. And if you can suddenly make a return in fixed income securities again, that changes the picture for all sorts of assets, including shale.
You mentioned earlier in the talk Saudi Arabia, and it came up again in another question. I wonder if through any of your sources or any of the research you did, you were able to get maybe an out-of-the-mainstream perspective on Saudi politics. Should we take it sort of at face value that, they're just trying to kill us off, or is there anything else at play? Particularly with things like the state-owned oil company and its IPO,
Right.
potential on and off again.
I guess the big picture takeaway, and I don't know if this is off consensus or not, that I came away with from Saudi Arabia is, I don't understand why it's good for us to want instability there. And there is definitely instability now, whether it's the rise of MBS or just the simple financial facts of the kingdom, which is that it can't survive with oil prices where they are now. I don't think the fact that they pulled the IPO of Aramco, I think, is really problematic for MBS's grand plans to launch new Saudi Arabia. There was a huge conference there last fall where they had all these grand plans for the spending and the new investments that were going to propel Saudi Arabia past the age of oil. And without that money from Aramco, it's not clear what happens there. But I don't see part of the perspective in my book of why energy independence is this mythical notion is that even if we could produce enough oil and gas to, say, get lost to the Middle East, I cite this analysis that shows how much of the components that our high-tech company needs are produced in Asia. And Asia gets all of its energy from, guess where? The Middle East. And no matter what, the U.S. doesn't produce a sufficient amount to supply our own needs and Asia. We live in a global economy, and it just there's no way that you can turn away from any part of the world today. I think it's this hankering for a lost era of American innocence that makes us want to believe that we somehow can. So I came away from thinking about Saudi Arabia with just a big picture. This is scary. And I don't know how much of consensus that is or not. I think people are a little too placid about it, perhaps.
First of all, you're the fastest speaker I've ever heard.
Oh no, I tried to slow down. I'm going to try to slow down, I promise.
Three things, sort of. First, to what degree are the analysts that we're talking to concerned about tax reform and how that might affect the oil and gas companies? Number one. Number two, the credit funds that you mentioned before. A number of them seem to be taking a bath on a bunch of these investments that they now own, some of which are publicly traded.
Yep.
How do you see that playing out? And I already forgot my third, so start with this.
That's good. I would never have made it through. I would never have made it through all three, but I will attempt to talk more slowly. I started talking very quickly in, I think, kindergarten because I hated reading aloud in school. And so I figured if I talked really fast, it would be over quickly. And no matter how I try to fix that as an adult, it eludes me thus far. Anyway, I don't have a great answer on the tax issue. Unfortunately, I've kind of focused on this bigger picture idea of whether or not shale is really economic. I think if it is economic in the bigger picture, it will continue regardless of gains or losses around the edges. And if it isn't, it won't. So, and as far as credit hedge funds pulling back, I think that's going to be a problem. Certainly if shale becomes distressed again, because part of the reason that only 150 oil and gas companies went bankrupt in the last bust was that money was there to bail them out, to restructure them, to come in and buy their debt. And if that money is gone and shale hits a rough patch again, it's not clear what will happen. Okay, go ahead.
What about Iranian sanctions, right? That reduces the supply, and shale guys are picking that up. How does that?
Yeah, I think it's the Iranian sanctions are a big deal dating back to the Obama administration, because it's one of the ways in which you can see shale influencing geopolitics. If it hadn't been for the advent of shale, a couple of former Obama administration people told me they never would have had the courage to go through with sanctions because of what it could have done to the oil picture. And I think the same thing is true of the Trump administration today, turning up the pressure again. It's something that is only possible because we are producing enough oil and gas that the Iranian oil is not irrelevant at all to the big picture, but not as critical to the big picture as it would have been. So there aren't a ton of concrete ways in which you can see shale making a difference in geopolitics. A lot of it is what people think will happen eventually, but Iran, I think, is definitely one concrete example of what's actually happening. And then I think over there, one more.
You mentioned that one of the reasons analysts justify high PE ratios was eventual technological progress. I've heard an alternate theory that skimming from the supply chain eventually will be the way that these companies are sustaining themselves. Like the articles about people who don't have high school degrees having Lambos in North Dakota. Have you heard that? Is that actually resonating with any of the analysts?
I haven't heard that. What I have heard is a broader argument that even if you take shale itself, which is considered the people, the sort of wildcatters of old who are out there digging and extracting the oil and gas, and then you look at the rest of the supply chain from the pipelines to the oil field service company, that the picture gets even more dismal, that nobody's earning a return on capital. And so if you look at the entire infrastructure of this, I'm not sure there is money to skim from in the end. And I haven't done those numbers myself, but after my New York Times piece drew both praise and criticism, shall we say, lightly, on Twitter, a couple of people reached out to me and said, no, you're not crazy at all. Here's, please don't believe these people. Here's another piece of analysis about why this is problematic. So perhaps not a great answer, but there you go. Well, I guess that's it. Thank you all so much for coming out. Hope you enjoy it.